Hello, and welcome to the Social Studies mini lesson. Some of you may be watching on YouTube, some of you may be listening on a podcast, and some of you may be subscribed to my Substack. Whichever way you got here, I'm happy you are here. Three quick housekeeping items we will go over each time. Number one, be prepared. If you are listening on the podcast, grab a notebook so you can take notes. If you are watching the stream, you can take notes or even screenshots. Number two, pay attention. These mini lessons are meant to be just that, mini. They are not long and drawn out, so put the other devices away and pay attention to the lesson we are about to go over. If you are a paid subscriber to the Substack, you can ask any questions about today's lesson in the chat and submit your review answers in there as well. Number three, this is quite possibly the most important message. You are the captain of your own learning. You only get out what you put into your education, but no one can ever take your learning away from you. Showcase your knowledge on the subject by completing the practice questions at the end. And as always, enjoy today's mini lesson. Hi, everyone. Today we're going to be discussing voting rights. Our social studies mini lesson objectives for today. We're going to talk about voting rights over the course of history and who was allowed to vote and when. So let's think a little bit about voting rights and how have voting rights changed over the course of history. Voting qualifications based on property ownership, religion, race, and sex have all been eliminated through federal laws and constitutional amendments. How old do you need to be to vote? That's another change as well. The age requirement for voting has been reduced. The age for voting is now 18. Was this always the case, or when did it change? On March 23rd, 1971, a proposal to lower the voting age from 21 to 18 years was adopted by both houses of Congress and sent to the states for ratification. The 26th Amendment became part of the Constitution on July 1st, 1971. Let's talk about the electorate. The Constitution originally gave the power to decide voter qualifications to the states. Who was allowed to vote? Initially, most states allowed only white male property owners to vote. Since 1789, many restrictions on voting rights have been eliminated. What was the first restriction to be lifted? Religious qualifications for voting were eliminated in 1810. This was followed by the gradual removal of property ownership and tax payment qualifications in the early 1800s. By 1850, almost all white males could vote in every state. Over time, the power to decide who has the right to vote has shifted from the states to the federal government. Let's think about post-Civil War. Who could vote? After the Civil War, the 15th Amendment made it illegal to deny any citizens the right to vote based on race or color. In theory, this amendment granted African Americans the right to vote. However, for nearly 100 years, the intent of this law was ignored, and African Americans were denied the vote in many areas. Next, we have the 19th Amendment. Who was given the right to vote under this amendment? The ratification of the 19th Amendment in 1920 gave women the right to vote. By 1920, over half the states had already followed Wyoming's lead from 1869 and granted women the right to vote. You may have heard about the suffrage movement, but what is the definition of suffrage? Suffrage is the right to vote. In the 1960s, there was civil rights, but what act was passed in 1965? During the 1960s, the civil rights movement brought significant changes to voter rights for African Americans. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 was passed to protect racial equality in voting, ensuring fairer access to the polls. The 24th Amendment, ratified in 1964, eliminated the poll tax in federal elections, removing a major barrier to voting. In 1971, the 26th Amendment lowered the voting age to 18, granting voting rights to a broader group of citizens. The Constitution sets 5 restrictions on the ability of the states to set voter qualifications. The first is race. The 15th Amendment prohibits denying the right to vote based on race or color. Sex. The 19th Amendment prohibits denying the right to vote based on sex, ensuring women the right to vote. Poll tax. The 24th Amendment prohibits the use of a poll tax in federal elections. Age. The 26th Amendment prohibits denying the right to vote to citizens who are 18 years or older. And finally, number 5, failure to pay taxes. The Constitution prohibits denying voting rights based on a citizen's failure to pay taxes as a result of the 24th Amendment eliminating a poll tax. Additionally, no state can establish voting qualifications that violate other provisions of the Constitution. For instance, a state cannot set suffrage requirements that contradict the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. Ahead of the 2024 elections, several states enacted changes to their voting laws, prompting legal challenges and debates over voter access and election integrity. Georgia, North Carolina, and Wisconsin. These states implemented measures that were perceived as restricting voting access. For example, North Carolina's legislature approved a citizenship requirement for voting, prohibiting non-citizens from participating in elections. Arizona and Pennsylvania were both states which experienced a mix of expanded and restricted voting provisions. Arizona's Proposition 133, for instance, aimed to prohibit nonpartisan blanket primaries, while Proposition 140 sought to implement ranked choice voting, reflecting the state's complex approach to voting reforms. Michigan and Nevada, in contrast, these states took steps to enhance voting accessibility. Michigan expanded early voting options, and Nevada introduced measures to simplify voter registration, aiming to make the electoral process more inclusive. These developments underscored the dynamic nature of voting regulations across the United States, highlighting the ongoing efforts to balance election security with voter accessibility. Here's our practice work for today. A reminder, paid subscribers to the Substack can submit their answers and questions into the chat. Number 1, true or false? The 15th Amendment solved all voter problems and made it legal for all citizens to vote in any United States election. This was true for both women and African Americans. Number 2, which 7 states had changes to the voting laws prior to the 2024 election? I hope that you enjoyed today's social studies mini lesson, and I look forward to seeing you again next week. Have a great one.